Duskmourn is nigh upon us, releasing September 27th, 2024, and we finally have all of the main set cards and the Commander Precon cards spoiled, and so that means that we can break down all of the best cards from Duskmourn, and today we'll be looking at all of the white cards, but I will be making videos for all of the blue, red, black, green, and multicolored cards. And I'll include artifacts and lands in the red video. Today, we are going to be breaking down just the white cards and just looking at the best cards that can impact the Commander meta from Duskmourn. My name is Nathan, you're watching Salty Productions. If you want to stay tuned for all of that amazing content that I just mentioned, be sure to subscribe and turn on that bell for notifications and like the video if you enjoy it. With that out of the way, let's hop right into some Duskmourn card analysis here. Our first card, and by the way, these will include all rarities, including commentary for Pauper EDH, if there are any commons that would actually be worth including in your Pauper EDH decks. Most of these are for normal Commander, but I just wanted to make that caveat that there might be one or two that are at the common rarity that will make it into Pauper. So we have Dollmaker's Shop and Porcelain Gallery. Rooms are a new mechanic that I'll explain super briefly, so you can choose to unlock either of the rooms as you cast the spell. If you do so, you get the effects of that one side of the room, and then once it's on the battlefield, you can at a later point unlock the next room, I believe at sorcery speed. And then if you reanimate a room, you then don't get any of the room effects. You have to unlock both of them. So not a lot of benefit to reanimating rooms, but they do serve a nice role in that they have a lot of flexibility. Dollmaker Shop, I think, is where we will pay the most amount of attention, although Porcelain Gallery is a good secondary effect on this particular card. So Dollmaker Shop says whenever one or more non-toy creatures you control attack a player, create a 1/1 white toy artifact creature token. Now, there are two special effects, I think, that makes this important. First, it says attack a player, so you can trigger this up to 3 times in a turn cycle, and my god, if you use this in Ishin to Heavens as one, you are going to get a ton of triggers to make 6 creatures a turn, which is absolutely nutty for only 2 mana. And also, the toys come in as artifact creature tokens, so if you have any sort of artifact synergies, this is going to be right into your wheelhouse. And then, of course, Porcelain Gallery on the other side of the room is 6 mana, says creatures you control have base power toughness each equal to the number of creatures you control, so a nice overrun effect there. And it's not even one time, it's just a constant buff being applied to your creatures, which I think is great. So you cast this for 2 mana or maybe even 3 mana once you have a couple of creatures on board. You swing out for all of your creatures, and then you can start making a bunch of toy tokens. Now, of course, the toys don't make more toys. That would be silly, because toys cannot obviously build toys. We need a toy maker to make ourselves some toys. So where we've seen this effect before, it's sort of like a mini version of Rabble Rousing. Rabble Rousing, of course, says whenever you attack with one or more creatures, create that many 1/1s, and it has some hideaway 5 shenanigans. I'm not going to bother to get into that, but we haven't seen this effect so cheap on an enchantment before, which is quite interesting. The other side, Porcelain Gallery, I couldn't find a direct comparable, but I think a relatively close comparable would be Mirror Entity, where you're going to be paying perhaps, let's say, 6 mana to match Porcelain Gallery's 6 mana cost, to then give your creatures 6/6 and base power and toughness, and they gain all creature types, and that's only until end of turn. So Porcelain Gallery, I think, is the first of its kind that we've seen, where it gives that constant buff, and obviously is great in any sort of go wide deck. Where you'd want to be including this card, I think, would be in your Ishin decks, like I mentioned before. The possibility of creating 6 tokens per turn with Dollmaker Shop with Ishin on the field is absolutely nutty and should definitely be an auto-include in Ishin. I'm going to have to go and edit my Ishin deck now. And then, of course, any sort of go-wide deck that wants to be making tokens and wants to be going wide will benefit from the giant buffs. So Jetmir is sort of a stand-in here for all of your various token go-wide decks. Of course, Jetmir being a more high-power token commander. So that is Dollmaker Shop, definitely a solid 2-drop if I've ever seen one. Next, we have Splitskin Doll, which is a 2-mana 2/1 artifact creature toy. When it enters, draw a card, then discard a card unless you control another creature with power 2 or less. Now, this is just your classic Spirited Companion effect on an artifact, which I think is worth mentioning because I love this play pattern, this sort of Elvish Visionary Spirited Companion play pattern, where you just make a blocker, draw a card, being safe from board wipes, making sure that you aren't committing too heavily to board. And I think it's great because it has synergy both in graveyard decks. If you care about artifacts getting into your graveyard, you can trigger the discard to put a card into your yard. Or if you don't want that card to go into your graveyard, it's relatively easy to just straight up draw a card by controlling a creature with power 2 or less. So any sort of small token or small creature deck using white will love this card. And I think if you care or have Spirited Companion in any deck today, then I think you can consider Splitskin Doll as well. So where would this go in terms of decks? Again, any sort of artifact reanimators. So Osgir, I mean, Osgir has a pretty high power ceiling, so I don't know if this would make the cut in Osgir if I were to seriously consider it, but it would make a decent low end just to continue to draw yourself some cards. And then anything that cares about artifacts, once again, so Urza Chief Artificer specifically cares about artifact creatures you control, and so this would be a nice cantripping creature to include in an Urza Dad Bod deck. So that's Splitskin Doll. Not a giant powerhouse of a card, but this is just one of those cards that's just a nice sort of vegetable to include in your early game if your game plan does not revolve around ramping. All right, and next we have Secret Arcade and Dusty Parlor. Now, I included this card for the Dusty Parlor side. It says, for 3 mana, whenever you cast an enchantment spell, put a number of 1/1 counters equal to that spell's mana value on up to 1 target creature. There are a couple of effects we've seen like this before, except that they're a little bit more expensive because they affect all of your creatures. So Celestial Ancient will do the same thing, but put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control whenever you cast an enchantment spell. And Boon of the Spirit Realm just gives a straight up buff. Creatures you control get +1/+1 for each boss encounter on Boon of the Spirit Realm. So I think Dusty Parlor is a great option if you care about enchantments, any sort of Enchantress deck in white, Sithis, etc. And if you care about 1/1 counters, I think you would put this in on top of Celestial Ancient, which you are probably already playing. And of course, Secret Arcade is the left side of the room here. It says, non-land permanents you control and permanent spells you control are enchantments in addition to their other types. So if you have any sort of, I guess, shenanigans or combo pieces that care about things being enchantments, then you can certainly run Secret Arcade. I just don't think that it is particularly powerful for costing 5 mana, although I'm sure there are combos out there that people have figured out that would make it worth casting it for 5 mana. But honestly, I don't like playing with cards, a Maskwood Nexus type of cards, where you are basically trying to have that be the glue to hold together like unplayable jank that otherwise would not work. But I guess it's one of those cards where if you do get it to work and you have some sort of combo, then you can pop off pretty hard. But mainly, I would like to mention this to you guys for the Dusty Parlor effect, where I think you can start stacking up 1/1 counters pretty quickly. Within 2 turns or so, you can generate a solid 10 to 15 power on board if you're casting a bunch of enchantment spells. So I think that is a pretty decent card for Enchantress style decks. And of course, you're going to be including this in your Sithis decks. Even Zur Eternal Schemer is a special call out here because his ability says target non-aura enchantment you control becomes a creature in addition to its other types and has base power and base toughness, each equal to its mana value. And once again, the mana value of these cards is the combination of both rooms. So this would be an 8 mana value, an 8/8 with Zur on the field, which I think is interesting. But of course, there's other Enchantress style commanders that would like this, such as Tuvas, etc. So Sithis is sort of serving as a placeholder for all of the enchantment or Enchantress style commanders. And I'll just say, as a broad trend, Enchantress is eating very well in this set. There's a lot of stuff that just cares about enchantments, given that rooms are a new mechanic. And so there's a lot of synergy with Unlimited built around enchantments, which is bleeding over in Commander as well. So very nice there. Next, we have Enduring Innocence, 3 mana 2/1 enchantment creature Sheep Glimmer with lifelink. Says whenever one or more creatures you control with power 2 or less enter, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. And then on top of that, which is already super playable, when Enduring Innocence dies, if it was a creature returned to the battlefield under its owner's control as an enchantment. So we've seen this effect a ton of times before. It's basically a welcoming vampire, but as an enchantment, and so it will trigger all of your Enchantress synergies, which is absolutely excellent. And then once it dies, it becomes that enchantment comparable to Takesha's Welcome, although of course the stipulation on Takesha's Welcome is different for creatures with CMC 3 or less. But I just wanted to throw that out there, that we have a few different of these effects within different card types between creatures and enchantments. I think this card is absolutely excellent. If you're in any sort of token deck or any sort of Enchantress deck, you will want this. And so our commanders spotlights that we have for this card would be your Delny decks that only run basically creatures with power 2 or less. And then of course Sithis standing in for all of the Enchantress style commanders that are going to want this. And it's so cool because even when Enduring Innocence dies, you'll get an enchantment entering the battlefield under your control, which will trigger all of your Enchantress, draw a card, blah, 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 do all this stuff, which is pretty great. I think Enduring Innocence, just a super, super solid include for Enchantress decks once again. And then we have Split Up, which is a new 3 mana board wipe. 3 mana sorcery, says choose one, destroy all tapped creatures or destroy all untapped creatures. And I love the flavor text on this. Says don't be a wimp, we'll cover more ground this way. Says Rian, former survivor. So this is just a great horror movie trope. You split up the party and then a few people end up dying, and they would have been better if they would have stayed together. So we've seen this effect kind of before. Particularly we've seen it for only destroying all tapped creatures. We don't have yet a board wipe that will destroy all untapped creatures, which is perhaps good, because I think Convoke decks and Vehicle decks would absolutely eat that up. And I think that this is and will be eaten up by those decks indeed. So what I have here for Commander, I think this is just a slam dunk in any sort of Convoke deck and any Vehicle deck. Anything that you're going to be consistently tapping down your creatures so that you can destroy your opponent's untapped creatures. Because the play pattern generally is, if your opponents have very valuable things on their board that they don't want to use to block or attack with, they'll typically just keep them untapped, keep them up as blockers. And so it's a great opportunity to destroy all of those untapped creatures that they don't want to be sending into the red zone. And then on top of that, let's say that worst case scenario, you have, let's say, a bunch of untapped creatures yourself and you don't want to attack. You can still sort of pick off whichever creatures that might be advantageous to be picked off at that particular moment in time. So let's say that somebody has like a giant tapped Galta that, maybe just swung at you, and you don't want to destroy a bunch of your creatures. Maybe you have a couple creatures that are tapped, a couple creatures that are untapped, but destroying that Galta is worth getting rid of, a few dirtily little doo-twos. Then you would absolutely cast this to destroy all tapped creatures to get rid of that threat on their board, and, sacrifice a couple creatures on your board. So I think that the floor case for this card is that you can still grab like 2 or 3 creatures off the board that you care about, at possibly the expense of your own creatures as well. But I think ultimately the best use case for this card is that you're going to be tapping down your creatures to either crew vehicles or saddle creatures or convoke things, and then you're going to be casting this to destroy all untapped creatures, which I think is going to be excellent. And next we have Toby, Beastie Befriender, 3 mana 1/1. It is a human wizard. When it enters, create a 4/4 white beast creature token with this creature can't attack or block alone, which is very adorable. And then as long as you control 4 or more creature tokens you control have flying. So I think we've seen this kind of before. The comparables that I could find, so Hallowed Haunting creates enchantment creatures, or I'm sorry, spirit cleric creature tokens, and then it will give those creatures flying and vigilance if you control 7 or more enchantments. So it's sort of a similar, like, meet this condition, you get a bunch of evasion on your creatures, and Akroma's Will is a one-time use, but also does a similar function. It's more, of course, a finisher, giving your creatures flying, vigilance, and double strike. You're going to be choosing most of the time. And so there are some examples of this that we've seen before, but I think that this is great for token decks, obviously. So it is trivial in Commander to make 4 or more creature tokens, and Toby itself will create one of those. So I think that this is great both in the early game and in the late game. In the early game, it's going to create you some bodies on board, and then in the late game, you cast this once you have all of your tokens on the board ready to swing, and all of a sudden they are flying, and you can go right over the top of your opponent's blockers. So I think this, of course, once again, Jetmir standing in for all of the token commanders out there. There's also like the Rabbit token commander and Ginny Faye. So this just goes into most token decks, of course, and then it is also a human and a wizard. So I wanted to throw out Greyman, Avastin, Stalwart as being a possibility as well, because it is a human, and if you give this +2/+2 and first strike and vigilance, then it's going to be even better. Human Tribal tends to generate a lot of tokens as well, so it's worth mentioning within those mono white human token decks. Next, we have Leyline of Hope, which is a 4-mana enchantment. If it's in your opening hand, you may begin the game with it on the battlefield. If you would gain life, you gain that much life +1 instead, and as long as you have at least 7 life more than your starting life total, creatures you control get +2/+2. Props to WotC for finally starting to template cards where it is based on more than your starting life total, so that we can accommodate the higher commander life total. And cards like Felidar Sovereign were never meant to be played in Commander where you start at 40 life, but it's legal anyway, so it's nice that we finally sort of reached that templating milestone where we're finally accommodating those commander life totals. But Leyline of Hope, I think, is absolutely a powerhouse in most life gain decks. Now, there's a couple of comparables. There's not a straight comparable for Leyline of Hope that gives both effects. So like Cleric class, for example, 1 mana, you get the life amplification effect, and then Righteous Valkyrie is sort of the last part of it, where as long as you have at least 7 life more than your starting life total, creatures you control get +2/+2. So we've seen this effect separated on different cards, and now we finally have that effect onto one. Now, I think the ceiling, of course, is if you start with this on the field for free. In Commander, it's not very likely, of course, because you can, it's singleton, and so you're not very likely to find it on your first hand that you draw, and I definitely would not mulligan to go down a card to search for it. But I think that this is going to be a great in the early game and late game for those life gain decks, because a lot of life gain decks will try to go wide as long as they are gaining life, and there's just a lot that you can do with both sides of this card. Now, this is, of course, so good in 60 card formats. If you run 4 of these and then you're running some sort of like Soul Sisters, or even, I guess you could probably take it over into like Modern, maybe, if you ran like some sort of Soul Sisters life gain deck that would then double your life total for 0 mana. That would be insane. But for Commander, I think that this is just only playable in life gain decks. I wouldn't play this in a generic white deck. And so some of the commanders that you might want to play this in would be like your Tristani, Selesnya's Voice decks. These decks can regularly accrue up to 100 to 200 life. And of course, with Leyline of Hope amplifying that, you can accelerate even faster. And Tristani has a built-in ability to create creatures on board to start buffing them. And then, of course, Lethiel tends to go wide as well, so that you can distribute a bunch of 1/1 counters whenever you gain life at the beginning of each end step. So that's Leyline of Hope. I think it's just a really solid include for life gain decks, but I probably wouldn't play it in generic white decks. All right, next we have Soaring Lightbringer. 5 mana, 4/5 flyer. It is an enchantment creature, so instantly great in enchantment decks. Flying, other enchantment creatures you control have flying. Whenever you attack a player, create a 1/1 White Glimmer enchantment creature token that's tapped and attacking that player. My goodness, this is an absolute bomb in enchantment decks, because we are going to be going wide. We're going to be making enchantment tokens. You're going to trigger all your enchantment synergies. This is going to be absolutely amazing. It's like such a slam dunk. I don't know. I thought like there's like not as much even to say about this card just because it's so freaking good. We've seen this effect somewhat before with Adeline. Of course, Adeline makes humans that are attacking each opponent whenever you attack them. So we've got that sort of token creation effect, and of course, Hero Bladehold does the same thing, but you can choose who the soldiers attack. Now, Soaring Lightbringer, of course, is going to go in your Enchantress decks, Sithis Harvest Hand, and because I just didn't want to mention Sithis over and over, although I guess I am still for this video, I wanted to mention, do you guys remember Daxos the Returned, which was from Commander 2015? It was one of the precons. I tried so hard to make Daxos work. Believe me, I did. I goldfished and tuned, and without just including all of the fast mana to try to get Daxos out super early and then start activating his ability, it is bad. It just is bad. There's no redeemable qualities for Daxos the Return, but I wanted to mention this specifically because if you have Soaring Lightbringer on the field, finally, you can give your enchantment creatures flying from making all of those white and black spirit enchantment creatures from Daxos' ability. So that was one of the downsides, was that it's just a generic creature on the field, and it was awful. Like, you didn't have any evasion to get through with these creatures. But now we've got Soaring Lightbringer, and so perhaps now those Daxos decks can be transformed into nigh CDH decks, I might say. Not really, of course, but that is Soaring Lightbringer, just an absolute auto-include in like every Enchantress deck that has white in it. All right, next we have Ghostly Dancers, another great include for enchantment decks. 5 mana, 2/5 creature spirit with flying. When it enters, return an enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand or unlock a locked door of a room you control. So I do like that it replaces itself right away. And then it says Eerie, whenever an enchantment you control enters and whenever you fully unlock a room, create a 3/1 white spirit creature token with flying, which that power it creates on board will absolutely get out of control. This is an absolutely insane card to create a 3/1 whenever an enchantment you control enters. That is insane. And like the room stuff is like flavor text, I think, for most commander decks. But, you know, Eerie is basically just a better version of Constellation. So it's going to be creating all of these all of this power on board whenever enchantments enter. And we've seen this before with Archon of Sun's Grace and Ajani's Chosen, of course. Now, Archon of Sun's Grace creates 2/2s with flying, and we see that played in almost every enchantment deck with white. I've seen this card played tons and tons. Ajani's Chosen, not as much because they're just vanilla 2/2s, but if you do care about auras, then I guess there's something to work with there. But Ghostly Dancers creates 3/1s for only 1 more mana, and it replaces itself. So even when it is killed immediately, you've still replaced it with an enchantment from your graveyard. Absolutely insane, and just a great include. Of course, we have the commander of the set here for white, Sithis Harvest Hand, being represented just in spades. And of course, any enchantment deck with white, so 2 Vasa decks want this. Pretty much any deck, any enchantment deck with white wants this. So yeah, Enchantresses, turns out they're really good. Who would have knew? All right, next we have the Wandering Rescuer. 5 mana, 3/4 legendary creature, human samurai noble with flash and convoke, double strike. Other tapped creatures you control have hexproof. This is a very odd card, and I think that there's just no comparables. Like, the best I could find is like Dawn's Truth or Flare of Fortitude. The interesting thing is that the Wandering Rescuer, I just can't really price out what its mana value would be in most situations because it costs 5, but usually, like, if you would run this in your deck, you probably have at least 3 or 4 creatures on board, right? You're probably running some sort of go-wide deck or a creature-heavy deck. So let's assume average case, right? You have 3 creatures on board, and that's going to cover the 3 colorless cost, so that would leave this costing 2 mana. Okay, so 2 mana, instant speed, creature, 3/4 with double strike that says other tapped creatures you control have hexproof. So now we need to tap the creatures we control if we want to save them. So it works if the creatures are already tapped, and I guess we can. I think we can overconvoke. I'm not actually sure on the ruling of that, but I believe you can tap more creatures than are needed to pay for the cost of the spell. So no matter what, this is basically always going to be between a 0 and 2 mana instant that says creatures you control have hexproof. Okay, so it doesn't save us from board wipes, but it saves us from targeted removal. So the weird part about this is that typically when you are committing to the board very heavily, you want that extra protection against indestructible, or you want to be phasing out. That's why obviously Teferi's Protection and Clever Concealment are so popular. It's just, I don't know if I would run this card to save my board against a single target, right? It's not intended to save your entire board, because why would you? There's very rare situations where you would have multiple things that are targeting your creatures. So instead, what you're looking for in these creature heavy decks is board protection in case of a board wipe. So I was thinking, where would I run this? In what deck would I want to run this? And I think you specifically need a creature that you really care about on board that can also make use of the 3/4 double strike. So specifically, I think this is a great include in Eowyn Shield Maiden, which is a human Jeskai human tribal deck, because in my playings with Eowyn, it seems that she is targeted quite frequently because she generates both tokens and card draw, and so it's just a giant value engine that's sticking out on the battlefield. So people like to target Eowyn, so I think I'd run the Wandering Rescuer because it is, of course, a human as well. And with Eowyn, if you have enough humans on board, it can be cast for free, and then you can get the trigger, the combat trigger, if it happens to be targeted on your turn. So Eowyn I could work in. Also, I think I just sort of threw out here any sort of convoke deck where you are going to have tapped creatures that you care about, all of your creatures being tapped, and it of course has convoke, and so Casla of course cares about things with convoke. So weird card to evaluate. You have to do a bunch of math with this card before you sort of arrive at a value judgment. But I think you either A, need to have a card that you really care about protecting, and you already have to have a big board, which is where Eowyn comes in, or you just have to care about any sort of other quality for the Wandering Rescuer, so either caring about the creature type, or if you can somehow make use of the 3/4 double strike body at instant speed, I think it is somewhat decent there as well. But definitely a weird card and hard to evaluate. All right, next we have Redress Fate, which is an 8-mana sorcery, but it has Miracle for 4. Return all artifact enchantment cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. Now, we've seen this a bunch of times before. Brilliant Restoration is the exact same effect, but for 7 mana, so ultimately you're paying an additional mana in order for the opportunity to cast it for its Miracle cost. Of course, the Miracle cost mirroring the, I believe it's called Replenish, it's on the reserve list, which is a 4 mana, does the exact same effect. And then we have Triumphant Reckoning, which is 9 mana unconditional sorcery. It does the same thing, but it also includes Planeswalker cards. So Redress Fate, I think if you're already running Brilliant Restoration or Triumphant Reckoning, just run this as well. I mean, like if you're looking for another top end and you care about your graveyard, like throw this in, why not? There's not much to really say about this card, I think. Also, the art looks really cool. But obviously, you're going to be including this in your artifact and enchantment decks, right? Anything. So specifically, like Tivit's going to have a lot of artifact creatures that are going to just go to the yard. And then Osgir, of course, has a bunch of artifact cards that will be in the yard. So anything that cares about artifact and enchantments really, I think, would want this card. And if you care about the Miracle cost, then throw it in over Brilliant Restoration. All right, so that brings us to the end of the cards for white, and now we move into the honorable mentions. And so these are cards that I don't think really quite made the cut for super good in Commander, but they are worth mentioning, of course. So we have Unwanted Remake, which is a 1-mana instant that says destroy target creature. Its controller manifests dread, which means that player looks at the top 2 cards of their library, then puts one on the battlefield face down into the creature, and other into a graveyard. If it's a creature card, can be turned to face up at any time for its mana cost. And so the obvious comparison here is Swords to Plowshares, which is arguably the most played white card in the format. But what's interesting is that although this is clearly a less good version of Source of Plowshares and Path to Exile. We don't actually have many effects in white nowadays that are only 1 mana that are just targeted removal like this. In fact, I pulled on Scryfall the, I guess, conditions that would meet this, and we only have really 7 options, and I guess of that, even 6. So Getaway Glamour doesn't really count because it's spree, and Giant Killer doesn't count because the destroy effect costs 3. So we have Blazing Hope, Path to Exile, Reciprocate, Swords, Time to Reflect, and You Cannot Pass. The point here is that I think that Unwanted Remake is a welcome addition to the hyper-efficient white removal spells. Is it the best in its category? Of course not, because we already have Swords and Path that are ahead of it. But I think it's number 3 to 6, somewhere in there, if you're looking for efficient targeted removal spells. The fact that it does not have Exile is huge marks against it, because destroy effects are just nearly as good on a completely different tier than exiling. And the fact that you have the controller Manifest Dread, which means basically if they get a creature onto the battlefield, they can cast it. So it's like a 50-50 chance for your opponent to essentially draw a card off of this. You know, it just doesn't quite make it to the tier 1 level, which is why it makes it into the honorable mentions category. Next, we have Reluctant Role Model. Quite an interesting little card here. 2 mana 2/2 creature human survivor. At the beginning of your second main phase, if Reluctant Role Model is tapped, put a flying lifelink or 1/1 counter on it. Whenever Reluctant Role Model or another creature you control dies, if it had counters on it, put those counters on up to 1 target creature. So this is like a miniature resourceful defense, which is a similar effect for 3 mana. Whenever a permanent you control leaves the battlefield, so not dies, a little bit better there. If it had counters on it, put those counters on target permanent you control. And the 5 mana effect is also pretty great. You can pay 5, move any number of counters from target permanent you control to another target permanent you control. So the question I was asking myself is, would I run Reluctant Role Model in my Atraxa +1/+1 counters deck, because it does protect you against targeted destroy removal. However, it doesn't protect you against board wipes, because if all of your creatures are dying, it can't put the, it will put the counters on the creatures, but then they will die. Unless you somehow buffed a creature high enough to survive, like a Blasphemous Act or something crazy like that. I just think it only defends against destroy removal that's targeted, whereas resourceful defense can hold counters itself. So I think honestly Reluctant Role Model is a worse version of resourceful defense, but it's still an interesting little card costing 1 less, and it is a creature body, and of course it can put counters on itself. So I don't think it would quite make the cut in most Commander 1/1 counters decks, but I guess if you somehow cared about 1/1 counters on creatures that are dying, if you're in some sort of like Aristocrats +1/+1 counter deck that uses white, then you might consider Reluctant Role Model. But just an interesting little card there. Next, we have Lionheart Glimmer, a 5 mana 2/5 enchantment creature, Cat Glimmer with Ward 2, and whenever you attack, creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. I just wanted to mention this for really just Sheen decks, because I think it's really good in Sheen decks, giving your creatures +2/+2. And I don't know, maybe we're at the point where 5 mana creatures you control get +2/+2 is just not that playable, but I do like the fact that it has Ward 2 and will trigger your enchantment synergies. Now, of course, we've seen this kind of before with Hero of Bladehold, giving your creatures, attacking creatures +1/+0, but this does buff them up a little bit more than that. And of course, Hero of Bladehold costs a little bit less, and it creates creatures. So Lionheart Glimmer, I think, is sort of a side grade, maybe just a little bit worse than Hero of Bladehold, but definitely one of those considerations for any deck that cares about attack triggers. Next, we have Savior of the Small. Now, this is a stand-in. I'm not looking at Savior of the Small specifically, but this is a stand-in for all of the new survival cards that care about or give you some benefit when they are tapped at the beginning of your second main phase, because this is great just in vehicle decks. I'm so happy that vehicle decks are finally getting some support where we can actually get some sort of benefit, or even in convoke decks as well, we get some sort of benefit from our creatures being tapped. And that's been some of the sort of weak points of vehicle and convoke decks, is that when you tap down all these creatures for this spell, but the spell itself isn't really worth it, right? We're giving up a lot of opportunity cost to tap down all these creatures, and so now we've got some value coming in on the back end that we're being rewarded for doing the thing with vehicle and convoke decks. So I'm just happy that Duskmourn finally is printing a little bit more synergies for any sort of deck that cares about having tapped creatures. All right, so with that, we've concluded the honorable mentions, and we move into the top 3 white cards from Duskmourn. And with a drum roll, please, we have Dollmaker Shop, Soaring Lightbringer, and Split Up. So, like I said, Dollmaker Shop, especially in a Sheen decks, creating as a floor, creating 3 tokens a turn for only 2 mana, with additional option to have an overrun effect sit there on the battlefield ready for use, is so incredibly good. It's going to be an auto include in any deck that wants to make artifact tokens or just tokens in general and then overrun the board. I think you're going to be seeing this card a lot. Soaring Lightbringer, like I said, just such a slam dunk in enchantment decks. They just trigger so many enchantment synergies and give your enchantment creatures evasion to help close out games there. And then Split Up is going to see a lot of play in specifically convoke and vehicle decks. I just think the ability to get a bunch of creatures off of your opponent's board while potentially saving yours at only 3 mana is great. I think you're going to see a lot of that in those specific decks. In generic white decks, probably not as much, although I am intrigued if you could just like run this, like just like slam it into any like white deck, like see how it would do. One of the things I like to do when I'm curious about cards like these is if you go to like Commander gameplay channels, like Commander at Home or the Command Zone or whatever, just fast forward and sort of scrub through different game states and just ask yourself, like, okay, would this card be good here? Would it be good here? Would it be good here? And so if you take a big enough sample size, you might find that, dang, like this card is actually good in a lot of just snapshots of board states. So anyway, if you're curious, you can definitely do that. Split Up is definitely one I'll be curious about, and I think that honestly I might have to brew a vehicle and convoke deck. Those are 2 archetypes that I do not have a deck for, and although I don't need any more additional decks, I might end up brewing them just because there's more support starting with Duskmourn. So that's where I'll wrap up the video, guys. Duskmourn comes out on September 27th, and I will be coming out in the next few days with all of the best cards in each color, including multicolored. Let me know in the comments down below if I missed any cards that you think are worth noting, or if you are excited for any particular cards out of the set. Like I said, these are my 3 most anticipated cards in white. And yeah, I'll be coming out with new videos in the next couple days, so stay tuned for that. And I look forward to seeing you in those videos. So once again, if you guys enjoy the video, leave a like on it and subscribe to stay tuned for all of my upcoming Magic content. And hopefully we'll see you all in the next one.